Hey everyone, I'm working to hit 1,000 subscribers, and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button right now.
For the Cincinnati Bengals remains under scrutiny, but did they just go into the offseason not expecting to add to the position? We don't think so. Let's break it down.
They asked him directly. They sat down with the assistant general manager of the Cincinnati Bengals, a man who helps run one of the most scrutinized franchises in the AFC, and they asked him, flat out, did you guys ever actually want to fix your linebacker room? And Mike Patats, God bless him, answered that question the way a politician answers a question about a budget deficit. He said all the right words. He mentioned value, he mentioned process, he talked about not wanting to overdraft for need, not wanting to force positions, not wanting to make mistakes in a vacuum. What he did not say, what he very carefully, very deliberately, very professionally did not say, was yes, we got our guy. What is up, everybody? I am Dre from Dre Talk Sports, and today we are cracking open the Cincinnati Bengals offseason and asking the question that every single Bengals fan has been asking since April. How does a team come out of free agency? Come out of the draft, spend real money on their defensive line, add Dexter Lawrence in a blockbuster trade, and still somehow, someway, walk into the summer with the exact same linebacker room they had when the calendar flipped to January. How does that happen? Because it did happen. And the story behind it is a lot more complicated and honestly a lot more interesting than just saying they didn't care. They cared. They tried. And that's what makes this thing worth breaking down. Let's go back to the beginning of the offseason, because context matters here, and I want you to understand exactly what the Bengals were working with going in. This was a defense that needed work at multiple levels simultaneously. They lost pass rush. They had questions at safety. And the linebacker room, Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight as your projected starters, was a room built on hope and projection rather than proven production. Both of those guys graded out below a 40 on Pro Football Focus as rookies. That is not a number you hang a championship window on. That is a number you look at and say, okay, we need to add something here. And by all accounts, that was exactly the Bengals' mindset walking in. They wanted to address linebacker. They were in on players. The narrative that this was always the plan, that they were always comfortable rolling with youth at that spot, that narrative does not hold up. So what actually happened? Here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the Bengals didn't just fail to add a linebacker. They made a series of decisions that, individually, each made sense, and collectively resulted in the linebacker room being the last thing standing when the music stopped. Think of it like a very high-stakes game of musical chairs, where every time the music stopped, they decided to grab a defensive lineman instead of a linebacker, and they kept doing that until there were no chairs left and no linebackers either. First, it was the Jonathan Allen signing. A former Pro Bowl interior rusher, coming off a release from Washington, available in free agency at a price that made sense. You take that. Of course you take that. Then, it was the Dexter Lawrence trade, one of the premier defensive tackles in the entire NFL, the kind of player who changes the identity of a defensive front, available via trade from the New York Giants. You make that call. You make that trade. Every single time, the Bengals looked at their options and said, this defensive line piece is more valuable than whatever linebacker is sitting on the board right now. And you know what? In the moment, for each individual decision, they were probably right. But add them all up, and you get to May with Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight still listed as your starting linebackers, and no veteran presence behind them to speak of. Now let's talk about the names that got away, because this is the part of the story that really stings if you're a Bengals fan. The big one, the one that apparently got closest to happening, was Leo Chenal out of Kansas City. Chenal was a name the Bengals were connected to early in free agency. He had the coverage ability, the athleticism, and frankly the profile that fits what Cincinnati tries to do defensively. But here's the thing about Leo Chenal. The contract he ultimately signed told a very specific story about how the league viewed him. He was not signed as an every-down starter. He was signed as a rotational piece, a part-time player, and the money reflected exactly that. So the Bengals faced a question that front offices face constantly. Do you pay part-time player money for a part-time player at a position of need, or do you take that same pool of resources and spend it on a position where you can get a full-time contributor? When Jonathan Allen was reportedly available, that question answered itself. And then there was the draft. The Bengals had pick 41, a second-round selection, and at various points there were linebackers on the board that fit their profile. Jacob Rodriguez, C.J. Allen, names that came up in conversation as guys who could have been the answer at that spot. The Bengals passed. They went with pass rushers, They went with Cassius Howell and Boyer Math and continued to reinforce the defensive line. And look, I understand the philosophy. Pass rush is king. Duke Tobin has said it publicly, and he means it. A great pass rush covers a lot of sins on a defense. But here is Dre's personal take, and I want to be straight with you on this. At some point, you have to cover the middle of the field too. You have to have somebody who can hold up in coverage against tight ends and running backs. Somebody who can fill gaps against the run without being a liability every time an offense goes play action. A great defensive line does not solve that problem on its own. And the Bengals are betting, heavily, maybe uncomfortably heavily, that two young linebackers with below-average rookie grades are going to figure it out in year 2. Now, to be completely fair, because this show deals in facts not just drama, there is genuine precedent for that kind of leap. The data on second-year linebackers who played significant snaps as rookies is actually more encouraging than you might expect. Jack Campbell came out of his rookie year with a 52 PFF grade and jumped to a 78 in year 2, which is borderline elite territory. Devin Lloyd went from a 48 as a rookie to a 78 in his second season. Christian Harris, Mike McFadden, multiple guys have made the jump from struggling rookie to competent NFL starter in their second year at this position. The average improvement in that sample group runs from around a 55 grade to around a 67, which represents a jump from clearly below average to solidly average. If Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight, who both graded out around 39 or 40 as rookies, can make a similar proportional jump, they become functional workable starters on a defense that is suddenly very, very good everywhere else. But here's where Dre has to pump the brakes on the optimism. Just a little. The leap from bad to average is not the same thing as the leap from average to good. And the ceiling the Bengals need from this position, given what they've invested everywhere else, is not just average. They need something closer to what Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt gave them in their best years. Those guys were not Pro Bowlers. They were not all pros. But they were opportunistic, they were scheme smart, and they were rarely the reason Cincinnati lost a game defensively. That is the bar. And expecting two players who graded out in the high 30s as rookies to clear that bar without any veteran competition, without any insurance policy behind them, that is a significant ask. The Bengals know it. Mike Potats knows it, which is why he was very careful in that interview to mention that the avenues are not closed, trades are still possible, veteran free agents are still out there, the waiver wire during camp cuts is always an option. He is not pretending the roster is finished. He's telling you there are still moves to be made. So who actually makes sense if they decide to pull the trigger on one more addition? Let's run through the realistic options because this is the part of the conversation that matters most heading into training camp. Bobby Wagner is still out there, 36 years old, which sounds like a deal breaker until you watch him play and realize he still processes faster than most linebackers half his age. Wagner's value at this stage of his career is not athleticism, it's football intelligence, and that does not age the way speed does. In the right role, defined, limited smart, Bobby Wagner could absolutely raise the floor of that linebacker room. The question is money, and the question is whether Wagner is willing to accept a role that isn't featured. My personal take? Wagner in Cincinnati, in a defined role, next to two young linebackers who need a mentor as much as they need a teammate, is an underrated fit. I would make that call. Shaq Thompson is probably the most realistic name on the board right now. He signed a minimum deal with Buffalo last June. He is not the player he was 3 years ago, but he is a former first-round pick who can still cover ground, who has NFL starting experience, and who would not require significant cap space. He tackled Jamar Chase in open space in December. Jamar Chase. In open space, there are starting linebackers in this league who cannot say that. Thompson as a low-cost floor raiser, a guy who gives you a real option if Knight or Carter struggles out of the gate, that is exactly the kind of move this roster needs, and it would not cost the Bengals anything meaningful in terms of resources. Matt Milano is another name floating around, though the injury history there is a legitimate concern. Bobby Eric was recently released and brings some upside as a coverage linebacker, though his overall track record is inconsistent. Jerome Baker is available but doesn't dramatically move the needle. What all of these names have in common is this: none of them are game changers. None of them are the answer. They are all versions of the same thing: a veteran presence that can compete, can provide insurance, and can push the young guys to be better by simply existing on the same practice field. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the best thing you can add to a room full of young players is one experienced voice who has been through an NFL season and can tell them what it actually looks like when things go wrong. Here's the big picture on this Bengals defense, and I want you to sit with this for a second before we wrap up. If you told a Bengals fan in January that by May, their team would have Jonathan Allen, Dexter Lawrence, B.J. Hill, Boyer Muff, and Cassius Howell on the defensive line, that they would have signed Brian Cook to solidify the safety position, that they would have addressed the pass rush and the secondary simultaneously, that fan would have been thrilled. That is a legitimately impressive defensive front. That is an identity. The Bengals have not had a defensive line you could genuinely point to as a strength since 2022, and arguably not since Geno Atkins was in his prime. They have that now. Trey Hendrickson is gone, but if Shamar Stewart takes a step, if Miles Murphy develops, if the guys around them have room to be disruptors because the interior is suddenly locked up by Dexter Lawrence and Jonathan Allen, this defense has a chance to be very good. The linebacker room is the question mark. It is the one thing that could undermine all of that investment, the one gap that opposing offenses will absolutely try to exploit. But if Knight and Carter make the leap, and the historical data says it's possible, and if the Bengals add one veteran floor raiser before camp opens, then this defense might actually be what the front office thinks it can be. The Bengals tried to fix linebacker. The opportunity didn't come together the way they wanted. They pivoted to priorities that made sense in the moment. And now they're sitting here in May, staring at a linebacker room that still has questions, hoping two young players remember everything they learned in year one and figure out the rest in year two. It might work. It might not, but the story of how they got here is not the story of a front office that gave up. It's the story of a front office that kept making what felt like the right call, one decision at a time, until the calendar ran out. Whether that's smart roster building or a costly blind spot, we're going to find out when the games start counting. That is the full breakdown right there, people. If you learned something today, if this gave you the real story behind the Bengals linebacker situation that nobody else is taking the time to lay out, smash that like button right now. Hit it. This kind of deep dive content takes real work, and your support is what keeps it coming. Drop a comment below. Do you think Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight make the leap in year two, or do the Bengals absolutely need to sign a veteran before training camp? I want to hear exactly where you stand. And if you are not subscribed to Dre Talk Sports yet, what are you doing? Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and make sure you never miss a breakdown. We are here every single week, bringing you the stories underneath the stories. I'm Dre, and I'll catch you on the next one.